She didn't argue. She didn't cry. When they took her baby mid-flight, she sat in silence until she whispered one name. It wasn't the baby's. It was the name of a federal judge, one not listed on the passenger manifest. A name no mother, on a casual trip, should know. The steward froze. So did the purser. And what began as a routine flight turned into a sealed case unraveling in midair. Because sometimes the most dangerous passenger on the plane is the one who knows exactly what they're not supposed to say. Before we continue with this story, make sure to subscribe to the channel as we have a special story that'll be released soon. The boarding area at Gate 7B buzzed with the usual mix of early morning tension and quiet routine. Passengers shuffled forward in small bursts as the gate agent scanned boarding passes, offering strained smiles and monotone greetings. Outside the terminal window, the aircraft stood gleaming beneath a gray-blue sky. A Boeing 737 preparing for a 5-hour flight from Charlotte to Sacramento. There was no reason for anyone to take particular notice of the woman in line, one arm holding an infant, the other pulling a worn black carry-on bag behind her. But some did. She wore a light gray sweater, faded at the seams, and jeans slightly too long at the heel. Her hair was pulled into a low bun, a few strands slipping loose near her temple. The baby in her arms, no more than 9 months old, rested against her shoulder, wide-eyed and silent. The ticket she handed over was accepted without comment, the barcode scanning cleanly. "Thank you, Ms. Harper," the agent said, without lifting her eyes from the screen. She nodded once and proceeded down the jet bridge, adjusting the baby's blanket. Inside the aircraft, flight attendants moved with brisk efficiency, checking cabin readiness, confirming jump seat assignments, and directing early boarders to their seats. Mitchell, the lead flight steward, was near the galley reviewing the manifest on his tablet when she stepped on board. "Good morning," he said automatically, but paused just slightly as his eyes flicked from her face to the baby's. Something didn't register. The baby's skin tone was notably lighter, with soft brown curls framing a pale forehead. Not unusual on its own, Mitchell had learned not to make assumptions, but it registered quietly. "Seat 1 for C?" the woman asked softly. "Right side aisle seat? You're all set." She moved down the aisle without hesitation, maneuvering her bag into the overhead compartment while still holding the baby. She didn't ask for help. Passengers were still boarding as Mitchell reviewed her entry. Camille Harper, traveling solo with infant Elijah Watts. He frowned slightly. The surnames didn't match. Again, not unusual. But he made a mental note. Family structures came in many forms, he reminded himself. Still, it stayed with him. Midway through the boarding process, Mitchell moved through the rows conducting casual. Chexie glanced discreetly toward row 14. Camille was seated, baby now resting against her chest, breathing steadily. She wasn't on her phone. No headphones, just sitting still, eyes on the seat back ahead. When he returned to the galley, he mentioned it in passing to Maya, the purser, one for solo traveler with a baby. Different last names could be nothing. Maya arched a brow. Was she evasive? No, just ... still. Calm, almost a calm. Maya sighed. "Let's not go hunting shadows, Mitchell." "I'm not, just noting it." The plane finished boarding on time, cabin secure, overhead bins latched. Camille didn't ask for hot water, didn't request early boarding, didn't bring a stroller. That stood out. Most mothers traveling with infants asked for at least one of those things as the aircraft taxied for takeoff. Mitchell moved through his final checks. Camille watched him briefly as he passed, but said nothing. The baby didn't cry during ascent, which struck him as odd. Most infants struggled with pressure changes, but this one remained nestled, silent, eyes shut. He glanced again at the manifest. Elijah Watts, infant. Camille Harper, adult. He considered whether it might be a custody situation. Possibly the mother had kept her maiden name, or maybe the baby had taken a different surname. There were 100 possible explanations. But Mitchell had seen enough custody disputes unfold on aircraft to know when something felt slightly off. Half an hour after takeoff, Beverage service began. As he moved through the aisle offering water and coffee, Mitchell paused at row 14. "Can't I get you anything, Miss Harper?" "Just water, please." "Of course your little one's been very quiet." She gave a small smile. "He's a good traveler." Mitchell nodded, but kept watching her. She caught his look and gently adjusted the baby's blanket. Her movements were smooth, familiar, motherly. And yet the feeling remained, as if something important was slightly out of place. Just enough to raise the hairs on the back of his neck. He brought her water and continued down the aisle, but the unease traveled with him. By the time he returned to the galley, he found himself double-checking the manifest again. "Camille Harper," he murmured. "Elijah Watts. 2 names. 1 story? But which one?" The hum of the engines leveled out as the aircraft settled into cruising altitude. Cabin lights dimmed slightly, casting a soft glow over rows of half-awake passengers, adjusting their seatbelts, reaching for magazines, or dozing against window panes. Mitchell moved quietly between rows, performing his second walkthrough. Was routine, a rhythm built over years. Scan the passengers, confirm seatbelt status, assess body language, anticipate needs before they arose. Camille Harper in 14C hadn't moved much. She sat with her legs slightly turned toward the window, her body curved protectively around the infant asleep on her chest. She hadn't pressed the call button, hadn't requested a pillow. When another passenger had bumped her row during boarding, she had simply nodded and shifted to the side without a word. There were travelers who preferred silence. Mitchell had served thousands, but something about her quiet wasn't about preference. It felt like control, like containment. He offered snacks to the row, and she declined with a brief shake of her head. The baby stirred once, but didn't cry. Camille adjusted him gently, expertly, her fingers moving with a steadiness that belied her age, early 30s, maybe? Her wrist had a hospital band still partially hidden beneath her sleeve. Mitchell glanced at it once, then looked away before she noticed. He returned to the forward galley, where Maya, the purser, was finishing a temperature check on the coffee carafes. He waited until another attendant passed through before leaning in. "That passenger and one for C. Camille Harper? Something feels off." Didn't look up. "You already mentioned her, I know. But she just doesn't talk at all, even when spoken to. No small talk, no eye contact. But she wouldn't even let me help her with water." Her hand was shaking. "She's alone with a baby. Could be exhaustion. Or nerves. Or both." "Could be," Mitchell said quietly. "But the baby's last name doesn't match hers." That made Maya pause. She glanced up. "You're still stuck on that?" "I've seen stranger things trigger child welfare calls. Remember? That woman on Flight 202 last March? The boy with no paperwork?" Maya sighed. "Yes, but that case was flagged in the system. This one wasn't." "Exactly. And that's what makes it weird." Neither of them noticed the man in seat for C shifting slightly in his recline. He was dressed plainly khaki trousers, a black quarter-zip pullover. No visible eye deb at his eyes had been tracking Mitchell's body language since the flight began. Russell Wynn had spent 15 years as an enforcement liaison for Federal Transportation Security. He'd learned how to spot subtle shifts in cabin dynamics without alerting anyone. It was something about the way the steward kept glancing back, toward mid-cabin. Not suspicious exactly, but purposeful. Wynn had noted it. Now he leaned forward slightly in his seat, tilting the small reading light downward as he opened the in-flight magazine and slid a notepad inside it, back in the galley. Maya finally relented. "All right," she said in a low voice. "Discreet. Check only. I'll ask her to confirm her destination under the pretext of cross-referencing connections. But we are not interrogating anyone mid-flight unless there's a damn good reason." Mitchell nodded. "Of course." Manifest again on her tablet. She's scheduled to disembark in Sacramento. No connections. Traveling on a standard fare, like infant listed on lap travel, registered as Elijah Watts. She gave no reason for the different surname. "I haven't asked yet." Before she could move, a chime signaled that a call button had been pressed. Seat for C. Maya glanced at Mitchell. "You want to take it?" Mitchell approached the first-class cabin, smoothing his uniform. "Yes, sir?" he asked as he reached the row. The man in 4C closed the magazine and set it aside. "Like a bottle of water when you have a moment," he said evenly. "And I believe I overheard something about a concern in the main cabin?" Mitchell's smile faltered for just a moment. "Nothing of concern, sir. Just a routine check." The man nodded. "Understood." Then after a pause, "Please ensure your purser flags any irregularities, especially if they involve minors." Mitchell froze slightly. "May I ask why?" The man offered a slight smile. "Because I work for the Department of Transportation, and I've seen what happens when people wait too long to ask the right questions." Mitchell nodded slowly. "Understood, sir?" As he walked back toward the galley, his mind raced. He hadn't said much, but someone had been listening. The beverage cart clinked softly as it rolled down the aisle, its wheels humming over the narrow strip of cabin floor. Mitchell moved at a practiced pace, engaging in small pleasantries with passengers, offering smiles, answering requests for ginger ale, tonic water, a second packet of pretzels. He didn't rush, but he didn't dawdle either. The cart made its slow procession toward row 14, and as he approached, he let his demeanor shift ever so slightly, more attentive, more careful. Camille was still in the same position. The baby had turned his head slightly in sleep, one hand curled into the collar of her sweater. Her tray table remained up, and she hadn't adjusted her seat. There was a stillness about her that Mitchell couldn't quite place. Not tense, but not relaxed either, like someone waiting for a signal. "Good afternoon," he said with a gentle tone as he reached her row. "Would you like something too?" "Drink." She looked up, her expression neutral. "Water, please." Mitchell poured from a chilled bottle into a plastic cup, no ice, and handed it to her with a napkin. She took it in her free hand, her fingers steady now. She murmured a thank you, but didn't lift the cup right away. "And how's he doing?" Mitchell asked, glancing at the baby. "Sleeping," she replied, voice soft. Mitchell waited a moment, letting a small silence fill the space between them. Then he asked, carefully casual, "First time flying with him?" Camille looked at him, not defensively, but measuringly. "No," she said after a pause. "He's used to it. He's a good flyer," Mitchell offered, smiling. "I've seen plenty of little ones who can't make it through the first hour without letting the whole plane know." She gave a faint, almost reluctant smile. "He's used to noise." Mitchell nodded. "That helps. Traveling to visit family." Her eyes didn't waver. "Just heading home." "Sacramento?" "Yes." Responses were clipped. Not rude, just lean. As though she had trimmed the conversation down to its essential shape. Mitchell pressed one step further, careful to keep his voice light. "And your little guy, how old is he?" 10 months. Mitchell nodded again, glancing briefly at the baby's face before saying, "You know, some passengers don't realize they need extra documentation if they're flying with a child who has a different last name. We've had people run into issues during connections." Camille's posture didn't change. "There's no connection," she said simply. "Right. Just wanted to make sure everything goes smoothly when you land. Airlines are tightening things lately, lots of new protocols around minors." Camille's eyes met his. "He's mine," she said. Her voice wasn't raised, but it carried a firmness that made Mitchell pause. "No one's going to take him." Mitchell opened his mouth, unsure of how to follow that. "Of course," he said after a beat. "Just doing my job, making sure everyone's taken care of." He moved to the next row, offering club soda to a man in a window seat, but his thoughts lingered on the brief exchange, the way she'd said it. Not defensive, but final. "He's mine." As if it were something she had to say often, as if someone had tried before. From the front of the plane, Maya caught his eye as he neared the galley again. Small shake of his head. "She says the baby's hers," he whispered when they were close enough. Didn't even flinch. "She carrying papers?" "Didn't see a folder? Just the carry-on." "Did you check with TSA about a flagged manifest?" "No flags," Mitchell replied. "Nothing official." Maya looked down the aisle toward 1C, her expression unreadable.
Ow.
"Then let it go." She said, "We're not the police." Mitchell nodded, but something stayed with him. He'd seen parental abductions mid-flight before. People looked calm. They looked like they belonged. but they also held onto their stories tightly, too tightly. And sometimes the ones who were telling the truth looked like the ones you least expected. He didn't know which one Camille Harper was yet, but the way she said "he's mine" had settled into his chest like a stone. Mitchell stood in the forward galley. The hum of the engines a steady backdrop as he tapped the screen of the crew tablet with deliberate slowness. The manifest was laid out in columns, seat numbers, names, fare codes, special assistance notes. He scrolled down to row 14 again. Camille Harper, adult. Elijah Watts, infant in arms. A different surname. No notation of guardianship or special clearance. No notes about adoption, just two names. Two people traveling together, and a blank field where explanation might have been. It wasn't unusual for surnames to differ. He'd seen it often enough: stepchildren, nieces, adopted sons, children traveling with grandparents, godparents, foster guardians. But there was a pattern that usually accompanied it. A note from the gate agent, a flagged advisory, a brief confirmation at check-in. None of that was here. He toggled to the TSA secure access field. No hits, no open alerts, no prior incidents on either name. Still, his gut didn't settle. It's not because of what was there, but because of what wasn't. He didn't say anything. Immediately. Instead, he stepped out of the galley and walked slowly down the aisle again. Most passengers had settled into the lull of mid-flight. Headphones on, seatbacks reclined, tray tables lowered for snacks and laptops. As he passed row 14, he slowed just enough to glance. Not long, not obvious. Camille was still seated in near-perfect stillness. The baby slept soundly. A hand rested protectively on his back. Nothing in her expression betrayed any tension, but there was an awareness in her eyes. She knew she was being watched. That much was clear. Mitchell continued walking, looping back to the galley. Maya was updating the inventory list, her tablet. Resting against a cart handle. "I'm going to escalate it," he said quietly, not looking at her. Maya's response was immediate but soft. "You sure? She's traveling with an infant whose last name doesn't match. No documentation flagged, no notes in the system, and she doesn't offer anything when asked." Maya closed her tablet with a quiet click. "A lot of kids don't have the same name as their parents. We've had this before." "Yes, and usually there's something noted. A memo, a heads up. It's clean. Too clean." Maya watched him for a moment, then nodded. "Who are you reporting it to, Captain? First, standard chain, then, if needed, dispatch. Phrase it carefully. No accusations." Mitchell stepped through the bulkhead curtain and approached the cockpit door. After a moment, it clicked open. The captain, a woman in her mid-50s, with a calm, firm demeanor, glanced back. "Everything all right?" she asked. "I'd like to file a low-grade passenger note," Mitchell said. "One for C. Camille Harper, traveling with infant Elijah Watts. Different last names. No flags, but it feels off. There's no documentation presented, and her demeanor is very guarded." The captain gave a slight nod. "Noted, I'll inform dispatch discreetly. No contact with the passenger unless instructed. Let's not escalate midair unless something shifts." Mitchell thanked her and returned to the cabin. When he passed Maya, he gave a small nod. Done. From row 4C, Russell Wynn was still watching. He hadn't asked for another drink, hadn't pressed his call button, but he had noticed the crew's behavior, the subtle tension behind their expressions, the way they conferred without looking directly at the passenger in question. It was a pattern he recognized, and the fact that it had taken root based solely on a name discrepancy meant someone on board had a hunch strong enough to trigger protocol. He made a note on his pad, discreetly slipping it back into the seat back pocket. Then he reached into the inside pocket of his coat and removed a small black badge wallet tucked between boarding documents. He didn't open it, just held it for a second, thumb running over the embossed seal before putting it back. The flight had 3 more hours to go. Whatever was coming would unfold before touchdown. He was sure of that. Mitchell, now back in his service station, exhaled quietly. Reporting had done little to settle the knot in his chest. If he was wrong, he'd merely offended a cautious mother. But if he was right, if There was something more underneath Camille. Harper's silence, then time was ticking. The sudden jolt came without warning. Sharp drop just a few feet, but enough to knock drinks from tray tables and send startled gasps through the cabin. A follow-up lurch tilted the aircraft slightly to the left, then leveled out with a low groan of shifting metal. For a moment, nothing moved except the flicker of overhead reading lights and the soft whir of ventilation systems adjusting. Then the seatbelt signs chimed again, brighter and more insistent. Passengers who had been dozing snapped upright. Laptops were snapped shut. Trays clicked into locked position with trembling hands. Mitchell grabbed the side rail of the galley, bracing himself as the beverage cart rattled hard against the storage bay. In the cockpit, a calm voice came over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, we've encountered a patch of unexpected turbulence. Please remain seated with your seatbelts fastened. Cabin crew, take your jump seats." Before the announcement had even ended, another tremor rolled through the aircraft. This one sharper, with a shudder that sent a ripple of alarm down the aisles. Overhead compartments creaked. Somewhere in the rear, Baby began to wail. Then came the oxygen masks. They dropped with a mechanical snap, uncoiling from the overhead panels like a fleet of yellow spiders. Several passengers gasped. A few screamed. One man fumbled with his seatbelt, instinctively reaching for the mask even as the turbulence began to subside. In row 14, Camille remained still. Her baby, startled by the movement and the sudden shift in pressure, began to crisharp and hype-sheege, the kind of sound that pierced through the chaos like a needle. Camille pulled him close, cradling his head against her shoulder. She did not reach for the mask. Her eyes were fixed on the back of the seat in front of her, unmoving. One hand gently tapped the baby's back in a slow, steady rhythm. The crying continued, but she made no sound, no panic. Just motioned a man across the aisle from her, mid-40s, blue polo shirt and wedding ring, looked over and blinked. His wife, seated beside him, leaned in and whispered something. He nodded. Mitchell, now moving down the aisle after the all clear. Chime caught the end of the sentence as he passed. "She's not even scared. That's not normal." Another passenger, 2 rows ahead, turned around slightly in their seat. "She's not wearing the mask. Is that even safe?" Camille adjusted the baby's blanket with one hand and tilted his head gently to soothe him. Her crying had softened, now turning into small hiccups and sniffling breaths. She still hadn't spoken, still hadn't looked around. Calmness, once merely quiet, now stood out in sharp contrast to the rest of the cabin. People were shaken, murmuring, some wiping at spilled drinks or calming children. She simply rocked her child, as though nothing unusual had happened at all. Mitchell made eye contact with Maya as he reached the galley again. "She didn't even flinch," he said under his breath. "I saw," Maya replied. "Everyone else reached for the masks. She didn't move. She knew it would stop. That's not how most people react." "She didn't look surprised," Mitchell added. In first class, Russell Wynn had taken mental notes throughout the entire episode. The masks, the whispers, the woman in 14C. His attention had narrowed the moment the oxygen masks dropped because he'd seen how people behave in moments like that. What he saw in Camille wasn't confusion or shock. It was something else. Familiarity. Like a person who had been through worse and already calculated the odds. He leaned back, his notepad now half filled with short lines and symbols. His finger tapped the seatback tray as he considered what he'd observed. Sometimes it wasn't what people did in crisis that revealed the truth, but how precisely they avoided reacting like everyone else. Back in row 14, Camille's eyes remained focused forward. She hadn't looked up during the turbulence, hadn't looked around when the masks dropped. The baby was drifting again into uneasy sleep. And for the second time in that flight, she said nothing. But the quiet was no longer invisible. Everyone had started to notice it. The cabin had settled again. The oxygen masks had been retracted, stowed by passengers with shaking hands or by crew moving methodically through the aisles. The turbulence had passed, but something else lingered in unease that clung to the air, thicker than the recycled. Ventilation could clear it in the forward galley. Maya reviewed her screen again. She had gone over the manifest 3 times, Confirmed there were no travel alerts or flagged passengers. Still, Mitchell's observations gnawed at her. The different surnames, the silence, the mother's unnerving calm during a crisis. Now, there were murmurs among passengers. People had begun to whisper. One had already quietly asked if Camille was really the baby's mother. Maya didn't want a scene, not with hours left in the flight, but she also knew the protocol. When doubt crept in and could not be dismissed, it was her responsibility to confirm custody or legal accompaniment of a minor. Discreetly, without escalation, she tapped the overhead button, signaling Mitchell to return to the galley. "I'm going to do a verification," she said in a low voice. "Now?" Mitchell asked, glancing toward the cabin. "In front of everyone?" "She's not responding to private cues. She's giving them more reason to talk. We do this quietly and carefully. Standard procedure." Mitchell hesitated, then nodded. "Want backup?" "No, just stand nearby." As Maya approached row 14, she adjusted her tone and expression calm. Non-confrontational, as neutral as possible. Camille looked up before Maya spoke, as if she had sensed her coming. "Ms. Harper," Maya said gently. "Sorry to interrupt. You again. I'd just like to verify a few details for our passenger records." Camille's gaze was steady. "Is there a problem?" "No, nothing urgent," Maya replied, offering a controlled smile. "We've just had some changes to manifest policy, and I'm confirming a few things about our travelers, particularly those flying with infants." Camille nodded slowly, her expression unreadable. "Go ahead." "The baby's name is Elijah Watts, correct?" "Yes." "And his age?" "At 10 months." Maya's hand hovered over her tablet. "Do you have any documentation with you? Birth certificate? Custody papers? Anything that confirms your relationship?" Camille's voice remained low and composed. "I wasn't told I needed to carry documentation for a domestic flight with my own child." "I understand. It's not always required," Maya said quickly. "But in some cases—" "When names differ, you think I'm not his mother," Camille said. Not angry, just direct. "Behind." Maya Mitchell had quietly moved into the aisle, standing a few rows away. Passengers had begun to turn their heads, pretending not to listen, but clearly doing just that. "We're simply verifying names on the manifest," Maya said, but the tone had shifted. Camille could hear it now. The phrasing was too careful. The pause is too measured. This wasn't a routine check. It was an investigation cloaked in procedure. She adjusted Elijah slightly in her arms. He stirred, opening his eyes, then closed them again, soothed by her touch. Camille's voice was softer. Now, but no less pointed. "You're not asking anyone else for papers." "You're asking me? It's just a standard no?" Camille interrupted. "It's not, and you know it." The words hung there. Maya didn't reply immediately. Neither did Mitchell. For a long moment, no one spoke, even the background. Noise of the cabin, the chatter, shuffle of magazines and headsets seemed to dull. Camille finally asked again, her voice quiet and level. "Is there a problem?" Neither Maya nor Mitchell answered. Not directly. Maya gave a tight smile, stepped back slightly, and said, "Only thank you for your cooperation." Before turning to retreat down the aisle, Mitchell followed her eyes. Catching briefly on the passengers nearby, several were still watching. A few whispered as they turned away, in the galley again. Maya closed the tablet with more force than necessary. She knew exactly what we were doing. "She's calm," Mitchell said. "To calm." Maya replied, but neither of them said what they were both thinking. They weren't sure what they had just done. They weren't sure if they'd protected a child or started something they wouldn't be able to walk back. In the galley, the conversation had shifted from concern to action. Maya stood with her arms crossed, the tablet dimming in her hand. As she weighed the consequences, the protocol was clear, or at least clear enough to justify a decision if framed properly. In cases where the custody of a minor was in doubt, and if there was any perceived risk to the child's safety, crew members were authorized to intervene under the guidance of in-flight command. Mitchell didn't speak right away, watching her. Think through it. The tension in the air wasn't spoken aloud, but it had thickened into something brittle. Maya finally tapped the cockpit, intercom, and requested a consultation with the captain. The conversation was short. Precautionary measure. It's no legal action, no confrontation. The captain deferred to Maya's discretion, but emphasized one thing clearly. If the situation escalated in any way, law enforcement would meet the plane on arrival. Maya acknowledged the order, ended the call, and turned to Mitchell. "We'll ask her to come forward under pretense of filling out a form," she said quietly. "Then take the child temporarily. Keep it low, no announcement." Mitchell hesitated. "Are we really doing this? It's a verification. Nothing more. People are going to see. They already are." When they approached row 14 again, Maya kept her voice calm and measured. She crouched slightly, just enough to meet Camille's eyes without towering over her. The infant was asleep again, his cheek pressed against Camille's chest. "Miss Harper," Maya said softly, "we'd like to ask you to step with us to the front of the aircraft, just for a few minutes. There's a form we need to verify, and it's easier to do it at the service station." Camille's expression didn't change. "Why? It's routine," Maya replied, her voice even. "Nothing's wrong." Camille shifted slightly, arms tightening around the baby. "I'm not leaving him, of course," Mitchell said, stepping in. "But it'll be easier if I'm not leaving him," Camille repeated, not louder, just clearer. Maya straightened, voice still controlled. "In cases where documentation is unclear, and in the interest of the child's safety, we're allowed to request a brief separation until verification is complete." Camille stared at her. "You want to take my baby? Just for a few minutes?" Maya said. "We'll keep him in the front galley with us. You'll be right there." Passengers had begun to watch openly now. One man across the aisle whispered something to his partner. A woman 2 rows back adjusted her phone discreetly, as if filming. The mood in the cabin shifted, slow and invisible, but unmistakable. Camille looked down at Elijah. He stirred again, one fist closing around her sweater. Her fingers smoothed over his back, once, twice. Then she looked up. "I don't consent." Paused. "We're not asking for consent, Ms. Harper. This is a safety protocol." And then slowly, Camille nodded. Her face did not shift. She did not shout. She did not plead. She only unwrapped the blanket from around the baby, her movements. Quiet, deliberate. Then, with a care that was almost reverent, she lifted him and held him out not to Maya, but to Mitchell. Mitchell stepped forward, arms outstretched. The baby's weight settled into his arms, light and warm. Elijah stirred, then whimpered. Softly in the new embrace, Camille looked at Mitchell. But her words were not for him. She whispered a name. Only 2 words. But they froze the air between them. Rowena Hartley. Mitchell blinked. Maya's face lost all pretense of calm. Camille folded her hands in her lap and looked forward. Mitchell held the child, unsure of what he'd just heard. But Maya knew. She knew that name. And the moment she heard it, she knew this had just become something else entirely. Mitchell stood holding the baby, Elijah's warm breath puffing softly against the cotton of his uniform, but he no longer felt the child's weight. His arms were locked, frozen not by fear, but by the quiet force of 2 words that didn't belong in the cabin of a commercial airliner. Rowena Hartley. He looked at Maya. She had gone still, the controlled mask she wore for passengers breaking. Just for a moment. Her eyes narrowed slightly, not in suspicion, but in recognition. The name struck something immediate and unwelcome. She glanced down the aisle, checking if anyone else had heard it. They hadn't. The hum of the plane had returned to its dull, familiar rhythm. Passengers, although alert, seemed unaware of. What had just been said? Maya leaned slightly toward Camille. "What did you say?" Camille didn't answer. She stared straight ahead, her hands folded neatly in her lap, her back resting evenly against the seat. She made no effort to repeat herself. No smile, no satisfaction, just a silence that said she had said all she needed. Maya turned back toward Mitchell. "Bring him to the galley now." They moved quickly but quietly, avoiding any obvious disruption. Inside the galley, with the curtain drawn, Maya tapped her tablet screen and pulled up the secure crew database. She typed the name without hesitation. It wasn't standard practice to search a judge in the middle of a flight, But protocol had already been left behind several decisions ago. Judge Rowena Hartley, Federal Family Court, Eastern District of North Carolina. Retired 2 years earlier, but not quietly. Mitchell peered over Maya's shoulder as the screen refreshed. There was nothing official, nothing detailed, but a headline had slipped through the security filters. Custody order overturned in sealed case. Judge steps down. No other names, no mention of parents or children. It's just a brief legal note. 6 paragraphs. Long buried under bureaucratic phrasing. The judge had been censured for procedural overreach. Allegations of misconduct were dismissed, but she left the bench shortly afterward. The records had been sealed. "How the hell does she know that name?" Mitchell asked quietly. "I don't know," Maya said, voice low. "But this isn't just a name drop. She said it like a warning, like a key she's holding." The baby. In Mitchell's arms began to fuss, small hands reaching toward nothing in particular. He shifted his grip gently, offering a soft shushing sound. Elijah's crying didn't escalate. He simply writhed a bit, uncomfortable in unfamiliar arms. Mitchell watched him, then looked back toward the curtain. "We shouldn't be holding him." "I know," Maya said. "But if we give him back now, we're admitting we were wrong. If we wait, she knows something," Mitchell interrupted. "That's not the name you pull out to bluff. It's a card you only play if you know what it does." Maya didn't answer. Her mind was racing ahead. Was Camille part of that sealed case? Was she the mother whose custody had been overturned and then reinstated? Had the airline failed to update records? Did the systems they relied on still carry a version of her that didn't exist anymore, an outdated profile? A shadow of a past decision no one had corrected. Whatever the truth was, it wasn't something that could be solved at 37,000 feet. She pulled out her notepad and began writing a message to the pilot. Request ground support on landing. Quiet approach. Potential custody conflict involving sealed case. Passenger has referenced judicial name. Recommend alerting legal liaison. She paused, then added a final line. Do not allow child handoff. 2 local authorities until identity is verified. In the main cabin, Camille remained seated. Her hands never moved. She didn't ask for a child. Didn't look toward the galley. She waited, still and watchful, as though she already knew the next 10 moves in a game no one else realized they were playing. And behind the curtain, Maya stared at the note in her hand, realizing that everything they thought they were controlling had already slipped out of reach the moment that name left Camille's lips. Russell Wynn hadn't moved for several minutes. He sat in seat for C, hands folded loosely on the tray table. Eyes fixed on the curtain that separated first class from the forward galley. It hadn't rustled much since the child was taken there. But he'd seen the steward's face when the name was whispered, saw the shift from authority to uncertainty in the woman purser who had made the call. Most passengers didn't notice that sort of thing. Russell did. He leaned slightly toward the window, adjusting the screen of his secure phone. To block it from view, it wasn't his personal device. It was one issued through a federal liaison program, encrypted. Direct to the Department of Transportation's legal compliance line. He typed slowly, deliberately. Not a panic report, just a red flag. Flight 2287, possible custody complication. Passenger mid-cabin referenced Judge Rowena Hartley. Sealed case possible. Manifest lists adult and infant with unmatched surnames. Crew appears unaware of connection. He paused, then added, request verification of active or reversed custody. Orders tied to Hartley's rulings. He didn't hit send immediately. Russell had been in this job long enough to know the consequences of misreading a situation. He had seen children separated from guardians who turned out to be their parents. He had seen passengers escorted off planes for little more than looking uncertain when asked who packed their bags. But this felt different. He'd read the name. On Maya's lips, Hartley wasn't just any judge. She'd disappeared from the judiciary quietly. Under a cloud of sealed documents and whispers about misused authority in family court, if that name had come from the mouth of a passenger, it wasn't coincidence. It was leverage. Russell hit send. Then he opened a small notebook from the inside of his jacket and began writing longhand. He preferred it to typing, the act of writing. Forced clarity. He jotted down the seating assignment, one for C. Female, black, early 30s, infant in arms. Unusual quiet, minimal interaction, the oxygen mask incident, the whispered name, the visible reaction from crew. None of it pointed clearly in one direction, but together it sketched a situation no airline manual could fully prepare for. He underlined. One phrase, unmatched surnames, that alone didn't matter. In context with Hartley's name, with the sealed case, history yet open to many possibilities. A court ruling overturned but not fully scrubbed from private sector databases. An airline manifest drawing from outdated court orders. A child traveling with a parent legally recognized by the state, but flagged incorrectly due to systemic lag. He reached for the in-flight magazine, slipping his phone and notes inside as a flight attendant passed. She smiled, asking if he needed anything. Russell shook his head politely and waited until she moved on before glancing again at the galley. Curtain. Still no movement. Still no sound from the infant. His phone vibrated once. A new message appeared, simple and clear. Noted, case potentially connected to NC 5441. Reviewing custody status will advise upon landing. Do not intervene directly. He stared at the number. When C5441. That was the sealed docket, the one with the disputed guardianship, the private litigation that had led to Hartley's quiet resignation. Russell hadn't worked the case personally, but he remembered the code. It had come up in internal training on judicial overreach. Cautionary tale. It was real. He looked back down the aisle. The crew still believed they were managing a routine verification. But they had stepped into something layered, something federal. Camille Harper knew that name for a reason. She wasn't bluffing. That much was clear. Russell returned the notebook to his jacket and adjusted his seat slightly. The plane still had over 2 hours until touchdown. Whatever was happening back there wasn't over, and he would be watching when the curtain finally opened. Camille sat alone in row 14, her arms now empty, her lap folded neatly as if still holding something. The seat beside her remained untouched. Tray table up, cushion undisturbed. She hadn't asked for her child back. She hadn't demanded anything. If anything, she looked quieter, now stiller. Her gaze remained level, unfocused, cast somewhere beyond the window, but never truly resting. There was no outward panic. Just the silence of a person who had learned long ago that control begins with stillness. Passengers continued to watch her in subtle glances. A few had heard the exchange, others had filled in the blanks. The woman with the baby had been asked to give him up, and she had. Now she sat alone, as if waiting for something she already knew was coming. Mitchell returned to the forward galley, his expression troubled. Elijah had finally dozed again in the corner bassinet they'd rigged from a spare blanket and jump seat harness. The baby had calmed faster than Mitchell expected. But it was Camille who weighed more on his thoughts. Not because of her reaction, but because of her lack of one. No bargaining, no pleading, not even a raised voice.
Just 2 words. That name.
He opened the crew tablet again and navigated to the internal passenger note system. Most airlines used a similar backend. It wasn't visible to passengers and didn't appear on public-facing manifests. Only accessible by authorized crew and corporate dispatch. It held alerts, flags, and behind-the-scenes annotations notes entered by reservation agents, security personnel, or third-party data partners. Mitchell searched Camille Harper's name. Again, basic info returned ticketed from Charlotte to Sacramento. 1 infant, standard fare. No seat upgrades. No disability notes. No special meals. But there was something new now. A code appended to her profile. It hadn't been there earlier. S-17. No description, no origin. No explanation. Mitchell tapped it. Nothing opened. Just the bold white characters next to her name in the alert column. He turned the screen toward Maya. "You've seen this before?" Leaned over, scanning the code. S-17, she murmured. "No, not one of ours. Not a crew issue tag. You think it's government? Maybe TSA, child welfare? I've seen S codes before, but they're usually flagged with a colored icon or a justification. This one just ... showed up. Is it from ground dispatch? Doesn't say. Mitchell stared at the screen. I don't like not knowing what this means. If we're holding someone's baby based on a system flag we don't even understand, Maya cut in. We're following protocol. He didn't respond, and that silence was louder than argument. 3 rows ahead, Russell Wynn slowly unbuckled. His seatbelt, he rose, stretched, and approached the galley under the pretense of requesting water. He smiled politely, the casual demeanor of a frequent flyer. But once the curtain was drawn behind him, the smile vanished. Let me see it, he said. Mitchell hesitated. See what the S-17? The code? I saw you looking at it. Oh. Maya's eyes narrowed. Who are you? Russell reached into his jacket and with careful precision produced a folded wallet. Inside, the badge gleamed Department of Transportation. Federal Compliance Division. I'm not here to intervene, he said calmly. But that code wasn't generated by your airline. It's federal, and it wasn't meant to be seen. Mitchell handed him the tablet without another word. Examined the entry, then nodded. S-17 means a case file tied to a sealed custody dispute. It's a legacy code from a no-defunct child protection integration system. It was supposed to be retired after the Rowena Hartley case was dismissed. Maya's voice was barely audible.
Out.
So, the system flagged her, based on an outdated ruling. Russell nodded once. Yes, which means this isn't verification. It's misidentification. Mitchell looked down at the sleeping baby. We separated her from her son based on this. Unless it's corrected before landing, Russell said. Airport security is going to act on it like it's real. The cabin outside remained quiet. Camille hadn't moved. But inside the galley, the implications shifted sharply. They hadn't uncovered the truth. They had tripped over it buried in a system that never deleted the shadows it once cast. Forward Galley was no longer just a place for coffee pots and safety checks. It had become a makeshift command post, constrained and heavy with a decision no one wanted to own. Russell Wynn stood with the crew tablet in one hand. In one hand, his federal credentials still resting on the fold-out counter beside him. Maya leaned against the galley door, arms crossed tightly, while Mitchell rocked gently on his heels. Glancing occasionally toward the bassinet where Elijah slept, they had stumbled into something larger than a routine verification. Something. Bureaucratic and buried, but very real. Start at the beginning, Maya said finally, her voice stripped of all formality. You clearly know more than we do. What exactly is S-17, and how is this even happening? Russell kept his eyes on the screen as he spoke. 2 years ago, Judge Rowena Hartley presided over a series of custody cases that were later challenged quietly. One of them involved Camille Harper. At the time, she was a newly single mother. The father petitioned for full custody, citing concerns unsubstantiated, as it turned out. But Hartley granted it anyway. The ruling was unusual. No prior offenses. No failed drug tests. No pattern of instability. Just a recommendation from a private evaluator the court had relied on too heavily. Mitchell frowned. So she lost her son without a real reason? She lost him for almost 11 months, Russell said. Eventually, Camille got legal. Support filed for appeal, and the ruling was overturned. But not publicly. The case was sealed. The judge stepped down shortly after. But during the time that ruling stood, data was shared with agencies border protection, law enforcement, transportation databases, systems that rely on automated updates, most of which never purge invalid flags unless prompted. Maya ran a hand down her face, and no one updated the flag. Russell nodded. Exactly. The S-17 code didn't disappear when the ruling did. It just sat there, waiting for a moment like this. For someone with just enough suspicion to activate it. She whispered Hartley's name, Mitchell said slowly, like she knew that was the root of this. She did know, Russell said. That name wasn't a threat. It was a breadcrumb. Her way of showing she understood the system was acting on outdated information. The curtains separating them from the rest of the cabin fluttered slightly as another flight attendant passed by. No one entered. The quiet stretched. Mitchell looked. Over at Elijah, he's her son. She's still sitting there as if she's waiting for someone to come drag her off the plane. She probably is, Russell replied. She's done this before. She's been through worse. What you saw earlier that calmness it wasn't indifference. It was a woman who already lived through the moment she thought she'd lose him. Forever. Everything after that is just protocol. Maya was silent for a long moment. Then she reached for her own tablet, pulling up the dispatch channel. We need to fix this before we land. We can't erase a federal flag mid-flight, Russell warned. Even I don't have clearance to override the manifest system. But I can notify ground authorities and explain the situation. If we move fast, we might prevent her from being detained at the gate. Do it, Maya said. Russell opened a secure message portal and began typing. As he worked, Mitchell quietly returned Elijah to Camille. She didn't flinch. She took him. Gently, as if she'd only just paused holding him, not surrendered him entirely. Her fingers smoothed the blanket back over his shoulder. Her eyes never rose to meet his. Mitchell swallowed. He was quiet the whole time, he said. You weren't wrong. Camille didn't reply, but her silence felt different now. Not defensive, just exhausted. As if she'd spent too many hours in too many rooms explaining things people had already decided not to believe. In the galley, Russell sent the final message and looked up. They'll be waiting when we land, but this time it won't be with handcuffs. Russell remained in the galley, hunched slightly over the narrow counter, as turbulence gave the plane a faint, lingering tremor. The lights had dimmed to late flight. Levels and a few flight attendants had begun whispering about landing prep, though it was still more than an hour away. The passengers were mostly quiet now, lulled into restlessness by altitude and fatigue, unaware of the quiet urgency building. In the forward compartment, Mitchell handed him a small envelope. She had this in her carry-on, he said, his voice low. Gave it to me when I brought the baby back. Said I should give it to whoever's watching the wires. I figured that meant you. Russell opened it. Inside were 2 documents. One was a notarized custody agreement. Clear, detailed. Then signed by a family court judge in Mecklenburg County, North Carolina. The second was a certified copy of the child's birth certificate, listing Camille Harper as the sole legal guardian. The name Elijah Watts was there, but no paternal information had been filled in. No father listed, no secondary custodian. Just Camille. He scanned the documents carefully, noting the date on the custody form 7 months prior. The signature was clean, notarized in blue ink, the raised seal still visible. And yet, across the top corner in faint red text, a secondary stamp had been added, pending dispute hold for review. Russell's brow furrowed. That's not a court stamp, he said aloud. Maya glanced over. What is it then? It's administrative, he said, pointing. Clerical hold tag, not part of the legal process. It's generated when a document is submitted to be scanned into interagency databases, but gets delayed due to system conflicts. Could be something as small as a mismatched middle name or a corrupted record during upload. And that hold, Mitchell said slowly, triggers an automatic flag. In some systems, yes, Russell confirmed, including the one used by transportation databases. Once a custody document is flagged as under dispute, temporarily it can remain stuck in limbo until a manual override is processed, which clearly never happened. So as far as the airline system knows, Maya said, piecing it together, she's a person trying to leave the state with a child she may not legally have. But in reality, Russell added, she's a woman with full legal custody carrying valid documentation that the system never finished processing. He turned back to his phone and opened a secure line to airport legal support, attaching images of the documents and tagging them with urgency code to... It wasn't the highest level. This wasn't a hijacking or medical crisis, but it signaled that legal review was needed before any enforcement action occurred on the ground. He knew the flags were already in place the moment they landed. Camille's name would alert both airline security and possibly airport police. But if someone reviewed the documents now, if the right eyes saw what he was seeing, they might prevent the worst outcome. He added one final note to the message. Manual review requests do not detain without confirmation of S-17 override. Passenger holds notarized active custody decree. Pending dispute appears to be clerical. He hit send and exhaled. Maya studied Camille again from across the curtain. She remained in her seat, unmoving. The baby had shifted slightly in her arms, now asleep with one fist curled against her chest. Camille's posture had changed only in subtle ways, less rigid now, less like someone waiting to be punished, but not relaxed. Not yet. Russell watched her for a long moment. "You know what's wild?" he said. "This whole thing could have been avoided if someone had just done their paperwork properly. One wrong keystroke, and she ends up branded. A kidnapping risk." Mitchell shook his head. "And no one ever checks until it's too late." Maya looked toward the cockpit. "We have to make sure they know. No surprises when we land." "They know now," Russell said quietly, watching his phone for a reply. "But surprises are what systems like this are best at."
The captain
announced the initial descent with the familiar tone of routine. Calm, practiced, slightly distant. "Ladies and gentlemen, we've begun our approach into Sacramento. Please return your seats to their upright positions and ensure tray tables are stowed. Cabin crew, prepare for landing." Kamel did not move. Her seat was already upright. Her tray table had never been lowered. She hadn't touched the in-flight entertainment screen or the magazine tucked beside it. Her hands rested on her thighs, motionless. Her eyes stayed forward, fixed on nothing in particular. From a distance, she looked composed. But up close, the stillness had shifted into something else: resignation. The baby was no longer with her. Mitchell stood in the forward galley again, holding Elijah as discreetly as he could manage while attempting to soothe the increasingly distressed infant. The quiet fussing that had started a few minutes earlier had now swelled into full sobs, sharp, unrelenting, and rhythmic. The kind of crying that drew eyes even in a cabin trying its best to ignore it. Maya had tried rocking him for a few minutes earlier, then another flight attendant. But Elijah wouldn't calm. He twisted away from unfamiliar arms, tears streaking his cheeks, lungs working with raw insistence. He was hungry, or tired, or afraid, possibly all three. And he wanted only one thing: Camille. Passengers had begun to shift in their seats. Some whispered, a few turned, frowning toward the galley curtain. A woman in row 3 asked what was going on. Another man stood briefly to stretch and shot a look down the aisle that lingered too long. It wasn't just consonant, it was confusion, irritation. The sense that something was happening that wasn't being explained. Russell Wynn stood in the flight deck hallway, waiting. He had requested a private word with the captain after sending the final documentation packet to ground operations. He'd received a reply within minutes, acknowledgement with a legal officer assigned to meet the flight. But it still didn't guarantee Camille's safety from procedural error. A flag like the one on her record didn't disappear just because someone attached a note, had to be lifted manually by the agency that filed it. And there were too many systems feeding into each other for any one fix to ripple quickly. The cockpit door opened, and the captain, a woman in her mid-50s, with calm gray eyes, stepped back and motioned him forward. "Let's make this quick," she said. "We're 32 minutes out." Russell nodded, keeping his voice low. "Passenger and one for C. Camille Harper is traveling with her infant son. There's a federal code on her profile that implies a custody dispute. That code is outdated. She has full legal custody, verified by notarized documents. But the system doesn't reflect that yet." The captain was already frowning, and when we land, airport security may be waiting to act on the incorrect flag unless we intervene. "I don't have clearance to override airport enforcement." "I'm not asking you to," Russell said. "I'm asking you to avoid making an announcement that singles her out. No disembarkation delay. No call for her to remain seated. Law enforcement wants to act. They can do it after she's already in the terminal. But if you isolate her before that, you'll escalate the situation in full view of every passenger." The captain studied him, arms crossed. "This has happened before. More times than it should," Russell replied. "Systems hold on to mistakes longer than they should. She's not a threat. She's a mother who's been through hell. Let's not make her go through it again in front of 100 strangers." The captain was quiet for a beat. Then she gave a short nod. "I'll handle it." As Russell stepped back out of the flight deck area, the baby's cries echoed louder now. Elijah's voice was raw with need, a sound that cut through the pressurized air like glass. Camille hadn't turned once toward the sound, but her knuckles had gone white, where they rested on her legs. Mitchell approached the galley again, rocking the child with rising urgency. "Oh, we need to give him back to her," he whispered to Maya. "This isn't helping." "I know," she said, glancing toward the aisle, "but the captain needs to give the go-ahead." From the jump seat, Russell looked toward 14C. Camille blinked once. No tears. No change of expression. Just a breath that she held too long before releasing it quietly into the descending air. The flight deck was quiet, the muted hum of instruments and distant airspeed warnings blending with the mechanical rhythm of descent prep. The sky outside was softening into early dusk, the Sacramento skyline still hidden beneath a layer of thin cloud cover. Captain Elaine Foster sat in the left seat, her hands resting lightly on the controls as she reviewed the landing checklist. She had flown for over 3 decades, handled medical emergencies, unruly passengers, weather diversions, even a bird strike over Phoenix once, but none of those had ever demanded this kind of decision. She looked again at the crew message on her tablet. Passenger 1 for C, Camille Harper. Custody status in dispute per manifest flag S17. Noted override request in progress. Legal documentation in her possession confirms maternal custody. Ground response team advised. Federal liaison aboard has verified documents. And below that, infant currently separated due to crew protocol. Passenger has remained calm. Child. Now in visible distress. Risk of incident if disembarkation mishandled. Foster exhaled slowly. The plane was now 25 minutes out from Sacramento International. Initial descent had begun. They'd be assigned a gate soon. On the surface, everything was ordinary. But a mistake now mishandling this situation wouldn't just affect one passenger. It would affect everyone on board, possibly beyond. She turned to her first officer. "Hey, have you ever heard of a sealed custody flag triggering an airline?" Intervention. The first officer, a younger man in his 30s, shook his head. "Not directly. I've seen unaccompanied minors and welfare checks, but not like this." She has a document. Verified by a federal liaison in seat 4C. The system's flag is outdated. If we follow protocol blindly, we hand her over to airport police based on incorrect data. And if we don't, the first officer asked, we override that data with judgment. We de-escalate. Allow her to leave the aircraft like everyone else, no announcement, no isolation, no waiting at the gate. We let ground personnel handle it outside the optics of a full cabin. The co-pilot didn't reply. He didn't have to. Responsibility was hers. Foster tapped her headset mic. "Purser to flight deck, please." Seconds later, Maya's voice came through. "Captain, I've reviewed the manifest and the updated documentation. I'm implementing protective protocol for the passenger in 14C. There was a pause. Then, understood. "Do you want the child returned?" "Immediately," Foster said, and discreetly.
Ow.
"We're not making this worse than it already is. In security, I'll contact ground control myself. No passenger delay. No calls over the PA. They can meet us outside the jet bridge. And only if legal confirms the flag is still active. Until then, we protect her as if she were our responsibility." "Copy that," Maya said. Foster ended the call and reached for the secure flight operations line. Her fingers hovered over the call button for a moment. There was still risk in this choice. She was wrong if something in the paperwork was forged, or if Camille wasn't telling the full story. It would be her name in the post-flight report. But everything in her training, everything in her instincts, told her that the greater mistake would be following the script written by a system. Too slow to correct itself, she made the call. A soft tone connected her to the Sacramento ground coordinator. "This is Captain Foster of Flight 2287 inbound from Charlotte. I'm advising on a manifest irregularity involving passenger 1 for C. I am requesting legal confirmation before any enforcement action is taken upon arrival. Passenger is not to be detained in the jet bridge or on the aircraft. If custody clarification is required, it will happen in Terminal B with appropriate representatives present. Confirm receipt." The ground controller replied, measured and professional. Received and logged. Legal team is already standing by. Will hold response until verification completes. No gateside action unless instructed. Thank you, Foster said, ending the call. She looked out the windshield at the horizon. Line beginning to dip below the clouds. The aircraft was in descent, the approach path locked in. There was no turbulence, no mechanical warning lights, nothing visible to mark what was unfolding behind the curtain. But she knew that sometimes the most important flight decisions had nothing to do with airspeed or altitude, and everything to do with people. The jet bridge hissed softly as it extended toward the arriving aircraft, its hydraulic arms locking into place with the same mechanical precision used thousands of times a day. Gate B12 was active now, the terminal pulsing with arriving passengers from other flights. But the agents stationed near this gate weren't part of the usual bustle. They stood still, watchful. Two uniformed airport police officers waited just beyond the glass partition separating the gate seating from the jet bridge corridor. Their postures were relaxed, but alert hands resting near their belts. Radio chatter kept low through the static of earpieces. Just behind them, a woman in a beige trench coat stood with a leather folder pressed to her chest. She was from the county's child welfare office, and she'd received the alert from airline dispatch 30 minutes prior. A passenger arriving with a child listed as possibly outside custodial rights. But she wasn't the only one who had received the alert. Near the window, separated from the cluster of airport personnel, stood another woman. She wore a dark gray suit, pinstripe pants neatly creased, and held a black briefcase with no visible markings. Her ID was clipped low, to her belt, facing inward. She was motionless, her gaze fixed on the parked aircraft, just now taxiing into position. As the plane settled against the gate, she took a step forward. She didn't speak to the police, didn't greet the child welfare liaison. But when one of the officers glanced at her badge during a brief moment of eye contact, his demeanor changed. He tapped his radio and murmured, "Be advised, we've got a Fed present. Confirmed badge, unknown agency." The woman said nothing. She reached into her coat pocket and retrieved a thin, sealed envelope, then waited inside the plane. Final preparations for landing were underway. Camille remained seated. Elijah finally returned to her arms. He had fallen into a quiet whimpering. Sleep. Her eyes had not strayed from the seat back in front of her. But her grip around him had changed. Looser. Warmer. The kind of hold that came after someone stopped bracing for loss. Maya passed through the cabin one final time, offering a last check on seatbelts and tray tables, but she said nothing to Camille. The flight crew had been briefed now. They would not call her name. No special instructions over the speaker. Camille Harper would disembark just like every other passenger, lest someone on the ground made a different call than the jet bridge. The child welfare liaison shifted her weight anxiously. She hadn't been given much information, only that a custody dispute may be in play, and that she was to intervene if the passenger attempted to leave with the child before verification. Her orders were procedural. She wasn't there to arrest anyone. Just observe. Document. Hold the situation until it could be sorted. But then the woman with the briefcase stepped forward. She walked calmly past the waiting officers, past the child welfare agent, and toward the foot of the jet bridge tunnel where airline staff were assembling for standard arrival. One of the officers stepped forward to block her path. "Ma'am, this area is for authorized personnel only." She held up a badge Federal Court Services. Then, without waiting for further challenge, she handed him the sealed envelope. "It's signed by Judge Hartley," she said, voice level and practiced. "It contains an amended custody order, a directive for immediate override of travel-related flags, and a declaration of administrative error. Camille Harper is the legal guardian of the child in question, and any action taken against her would now constitute unlawful interference." The officer stared at the envelope. "Hartley sent you?" "Yes," she replied. "If anyone interferes with that mother today, they'll answer to federal court, not local review." She stepped back and waited. The child welfare representative looked down, uncertain. Her tablet vibrated. An update had arrived. She tapped the screen and scanned the new data. The custody flag had been removed. The S-17 code was marked obsolete inside. The plane, the seatbelt sign clicked off. Passengers stood. Overhead compartments opened. Camille remained seated a moment longer, waiting. Then gently, she rose with her son in her arms. She stepped into the aisle without hesitation, unaware that behind the terminal glass, the ground had already moved first. The descent into Sacramento had begun. And with it came the subtle shifts that every seasoned traveler recognized: the gentle nose-down angle, the deepening hum of the engines, the change in cabin pressure that made children fuss and adults swallow instinctively. Overhead bins rattled softly as the aircraft adjusted its course, slicing through a layer of early evening cloud cover. The city lights, still distant, began to shimmer faintly through the mist. Camille remained seated, her posture unchanged. Elijah, heavy with sleep, rested against her chest. The cabin around her stirred to life. People began to gather their belongings. Check phones for signal, glance out windows as if orientation would help them land faster. But Camille's gaze stayed forward. The moment wasn't about landing for hurt, was about what came next. Mitchell moved past her row, checking the final rows for compliance. He said nothing this time, just offered her a small nod that carried more weight than words. She acknowledged it with the barest tilt of her head. She hadn't spoken since the baby was returned. No one, not even the crew, had asked her for an explanation. Until now, Russell Wynn stepped into the aisle, steadying himself with one hand against a seat back as the plane continued its descent. He didn't wear his badge openly, nor did he carry any of the visible authority that would mark him to the other passengers. He simply looked like a man who had spent the flight watching and waiting. As he reached row 14, he lowered his voice and spoke for the first time directly to Camille. "Miss Harper, may I sit for a moment?" She looked up at him, not surprised, not worried, just tired. She gestured to the empty seat beside her without speaking. He sat, buckled in, and waited until the cabin noise swelled again before continuing. "You don't have to talk. I just thought you might want someone to hear your side before everyone else fills it in for you." She turned her face slightly toward the window. "They already have," she said quietly. "They did before I boarded." Russell kept his voice even. The custody flag was based on a clerical error. "I've seen the documents. They're real. You have full custody." Camille didn't answer right away. She adjusted the blanket around Elijah's back and ran one finger gently along his spine. "2 years ago," she began, "I left a man who didn't want a child until I had one without asking his permission. When Elijah was 3 months old, he filed for custody. Claimed I was unstable, said I moved too often, didn't have a stable home. None of it was true. But his attorney had connections. Judge Hartley ruled in his favor. Her voice was calm, not detached but measured, like someone who had told this story too many times and had learned which parts people stopped listening to first. They took him from me, placed him with a foster guardian while the case was reviewed. I saw him twice in 11 months, and the decision was overturned. Quietly, no apology, just a letter in a stamped form." Russell watched her carefully and Hartley. "She never explained herself, just retired. But I learned later. My name stayed in the system as a flagged case. The reversal didn't update everything. One judge signed a correction. A different clerk forgot to check a box." She looked at him. Then, for the first time fully, "You want to know why I stayed calm?" she asked. "Because the last time I screamed, they told the court I was aggressive. The last time I cried, they said I was unstable. I learned that stillness is the only thing that doesn't get written down against you." Russell said nothing, didn't have an answer for that. He'd worked too many cases where the quiet ones had the most to say. Camille looked forward again. "I think this story started with a plane ticket," she said. "Didn't it start the day someone decided a woman like me didn't look like someone's mother?" The landing gear lowered with a deep mechanical thud, and the cabin tilted slightly as the plane aligned with the runway. Passengers braced instinctively. Over the intercom, the captain's voice returned, soft and steady. "Flight attendants prepare for landing." Russell remained seated beside her as the aircraft touched down. No more questions. No more explanations. The narrative had rewritten itself, not through systems or flags, but through the voice that had finally been asked to speak. The aircraft taxied slowly toward Gate B-12, its wheels rolling across the tarmac with the familiar groan of rubber over concrete. Inside, passengers remained seated, their seatbelts still fastened, belongings gathered loosely in their laps. The soft chime of the arrival signal had just sounded, and while most passengers were preparing for the usual shuffle toward the aisle, a few near the front remained still watching the crew, sensing something beneath the surface that hadn't yet been spoken aloud. Russell Wynn sat in for C, his government-issued device resting quietly in his lap. He hadn't turned it off when instructed, and no one had pressed him to do so. Moments earlier, just as the landing gear hit the runway, a secure message had arrived, one that bypassed traditional communication channels and came with a level of clearance few within the Department of Transportation ever encountered. The message was simple, but the file attached was not. A signed letter on judicial stationery, with a digital watermark, bore the unmistakable name Hun. Rowena M. Hartley Rhett. Russell scrolled through the document slowly, eyes scanning every line. The message wasn't addressed to him directly, but had been transmitted through a channel that ensured it would reach his hands. It was written not in legalese, but in plain, deliberate language, confirmed what Camille had said, and more. The sealed case in C-5441 had not just been a contested custody matter. It had been part of an internal investigation involving the rerouting of at-risk infants into a foster network with political and financial connections. The process had been facilitated through informal referrals, questionable psychological evaluations, and quiet judicial compliance. Camille Harper had been one of the first women to raise concerns after her child was removed on the basis of what the letter now described as fabricated behavioral concerns. The judge's note was blunt in its admission, in my capacity. At the time, I approved an emergency custody order against Camille Harper based on recommendations I did not sufficiently verify. The case was later reviewed, and it became clear that systemic misjudgment had occurred. Upon reversal of the order, I authorized the redaction of Camille Harper's name from all public records to prevent retaliatory targeting from individuals connected to the compromised foster network. Russell's jaw tightened as he read. Camille hadn't just been a mother fighting for custodias. She had been a witness, unknowingly entangled in a larger system of manipulation. And the reason her name remained absent from every court summary, every searchable ruling, every accessible record, was because someone had tried to protect her, but the system had failed to protect her from itself. Further down, the letter included an addendum, a court directive authorizing the full reinstatement of her custodial rights, verified by both state and federal agencies. The final line read, "This letter shall serve as legal confirmation that Camille Harper is, and has always been, the lawful guardian of Elijah Watts. Any obstruction of her rights under this assumption is a violation of federal protective order protocols." Russell leaned back in his seat, the hum of the engines now barely audible beneath the clicking of overhead bins being opened and jackets being pulled down. Around him, passengers had begun to stand, but he remained seated, holding the device in his hand, absorbing the weight of what he now knew. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a second device, a secure contact line to his liaison at Sacramento's Federal Intake Center. He pressed a button and waited for a tone. "This is Wynn. Confirm receipt of judicial override from Hartley. Passenger 14C is not to be detained, questioned, or delayed. I'll escort her through if necessary. Make sure your people understand what's at stake." He ended the call and looked toward the aisle. Camille hadn't stood yet. She waited as others filtered out in front of her, her son still cradled quietly in her arms. Her face was unreadable, but her posture was different now. Not defensive, not wary, just steady, like someone who had always known the truth and was finally watching the world catch up to it. The aircraft door had not yet opened when Mitchell returned to the galley, his arms heavy, though the child he carried was small. Elijah was quiet now, blinking sleepily against the overhead lights, his head nestled against Mitchell's shoulder. The crying had stopped once he'd been passed from one attendant to another, each trying their best to soothe him, none succeeding. For more than a few minutes. But now the child was silent, not out of peace, Mitchell suspected, but fatigue. Mitchell adjusted his hold, one hand steady against the baby's back, and turned toward the cabin. Passengers were beginning to gather their things. Luggage shifted above. Seatbacks popped upright. But he didn't move toward the exit, not yet. Instead, he walked a few steps to row 14. Camille was still seated, her tray table up, her seatbelt unclasped but untouched. Her carry-on bag rested at her feet, her posture as composed as it had been when she first boarded the plane. She wasn't watching the passengers leaving. She wasn't even watching the aisle. Her eyes were lowered, fixed on some space between her lap and the floor, as if she were still waiting for the moment to declare itself over. Mitchell approached slowly. No one told him to. No protocol required it. The child could have been handed over by someone else, some neutral pair of hands to avoid discomfort. But Mitchell had insisted he needed to be the one. Not because it would fix anything, but because there was nothing else left to do. He knelt beside her seat. "Miss Harper," he said softly. She looked up. Her expression didn't shift. No tension in the jaw, no narrowed eyes, no defense. A woman receiving information, receiving presence, and preparing for whatever followed. "I believe," he said, barely above a whisper, "this belongs to you." He extended Elijah carefully. The baby reached forward before Mitchell could fully lower him, arms stretching instinctively toward his mother. It was the first full movement he'd made in nearly an hour. Camille took him without hesitation. She didn't look at Mitchell. She didn't thank him. She didn't scold or question or ask why. She simply accepted her child the way someone receives, something they were never supposed to have lost in the first place. Elijah settled instantly. One hand gripped the front of her sweater, his small cheek pressed against her collarbone. Mitchell watched as her arms wrapped around him in a fluid motion, not desperate, not dramatic, just final, as if he had never been taken away, as if she had never had to let go. And in that gesture, Mitchell saw everything he had missed. She didn't cry. He had expected tears, maybe words something sharp, something righteous. He had prepared himself for confrontation. But what he got, instead, was silence. A silence that said she had been through this before, or something like it, and that nothing he could say would surprise her. He remained kneeling, unsure now of what to do. He wanted to speak, apologize. He wanted to say, "I thought I was protecting someone, or they trained us to look for signs, or even, I didn't know what I was doing until it was too late." But all of it felt too small now. It's too late, too easy. Camille adjusted Elijah slightly in her arms. He was asleep again, or nearly. One of his hands twitched softly against her side. "I'm sorry," Mitchell finally said, though the words felt inadequate. The moment they left his mouth, Camille looked down at Elijah and said nothing. Mitchell nodded once, accepting the silence as its own kind of answer, and rose to his feet. As he stepped away, he caught the eye of another passenger who had been watching from across the aisle. Their look wasn't judgmental, just curious, confused. No one else would know the details of what had happened during the flight. But Mitchell would. He would carry it long after the plane emptied, after the next boarding call, after the uniforms changed and the safety announcements played again. He would remember how a policy, followed without question, had nearly unraveled something irreparable. And he would remember how the mother never said a single thing, because she didn't have to. She had her son. That was all. The jet bridge hadn't fully locked into place when two uniformed officers stepped through the terminal doors. Flanked by a woman in civilian dress holding a plain black briefcase. Behind them, just out of view from the aircraft, windows, a marked airport security vehicle remained idling with its hazard lights blinking in the gray evening light. No sirens, no urgency, just quiet, calculated movement. Inside the cabin, the atmosphere was still suspended. Most passengers had collected their bags, coats draped over shoulders, earbuds in place, ready to shuffle down the aisle. The energy had shifted after landing, but something invisible still lingered. There had been no pilot announcement since touchdown. No flight attendant farewell, just silence. A kind of collective pause, as if everyone was waiting for something to resolve itself before they could move again. Camille remained seated in row 14, Elijah asleep in her arms. His breathing was steady now, one small hand curled into the fabric of her scarf. Her body barely moved except for the slow rhythm of her chest rising and falling. She didn't turn toward the front of the cabin. She didn't need to. Near the cockpit door, Agent Russell Wynn stood facing the aisle. His credentials, though discreetly tucked, were now fully visible to those who needed to see them. The purser, now pale and subdued, stood behind him. Mitchell, arms folded and eyes lowered, hovered at the front galley. Whatever chain of command normally governed, this point of the flight had been quietly overridden. The police stepped onto the plane. One of them, a younger officer with tight shoulders and a tight grip on his belt, took a breath to speak. Wynn raised a hand before a word could pass. "Officers," he said, voice low but firm. "This flight is now under review by federal security protocol." The older of the two officers, a sergeant with more years than patience, stepped forward. "We received a request for passenger separation, custodial verification. We're here to execute that protocol. Protocol has been rescinded," Wynn said. He reached into his coat and produced a slim, trifold wallet. Inside, along with his ID, was a single sheet of paper creased from quick handling, but bearing the embossed seal of the Department of Child and Family Services and a digital, time-stamped from 20 minutes earlier. "The passenger in question," he continued, "is Camille Harper. She is the legal guardian of the child in her custody. Her paperwork has been reviewed, verified, and filed into the system. Any action taken against her now would constitute unlawful detainment." The civilian woman with the briefcase stepped forward. "I have a counter-directive from the family court liaison." It was overridden. Wynn cut in. "By Judge Rowena Hartley. In writing. If you'd like to make a call, I suggest doing it outside this cabin." The sergeant glanced at his partner, who looked visibly relieved not to be the one deciding what happened next. The woman in civilian clothing tightened her grip on the briefcase, but said nothing more. The officers exchanged one final look with Wynn. Then, without comment, they turned and stepped back through the aircraft door. The woman followed, her pace clipped. The soft click of the jet bridge reattaching echoed through the front of the plane. No announcement followed. The cabin crew didn't speak. The seatbelt light flicked off again. The chime sounded. Passengers stood, but more slowly now, confused. By the exchange they had only partially witnessed. A few craned their necks toward Camille, but no one asked questions. The baby stirred against her shoulder, blinking as the noise around them rose. She shifted him slightly, kissed the side of his head, and waited. Row by row, the passengers filed out. No one acknowledged what had happened. No one needed to. Whatever had threatened to fracture the journey had quietly broken apart, not with confrontation, but with paper and silence. At the aircraft door, Wynn stood aside as the first passengers exited. He didn't watch them. He waited only for one. When Camille rose and walked past him, still holding her son, their eyes met briefly. He gave a nod, not of authority, but of understanding, and she walked past without pause. In the weeks that followed, a quiet audit began, announced and largely untraceable to the public. It started with a single memo circulated internally. Through the Department of Transportation, marked Internal Inquiry, with a soft directive to review recent in-flight custodial interventions. On the surface, it was routine. A post-incident procedural check. Nothing more. But someone at the top had taken interest. Not because of a passenger complaint or viral video, there had been none, but because of the name whispered mid-flight, and the quiet flurry of secured communications that followed. Judge Rowena Hartley's letter had triggered more than just a correction. Her statement acknowledging a sealed reversal on a custody ruling prompted someone in the Federal Review Office to run Camille Harper's case through the central database again. It should have been routine. The system produced two conflicting results. One version of the case showed full custodial rights returned to Camille. It was stamped, sealed, and time-stamped from over 14 months prior. The other, the version, still accessible by flight staff, flagged her as custodial non-primary S-17. That tag, S-17, had originally been shorthand for cases undergoing interagency legal review involving minors. In practice, it meant custody wasn't clearly resolved and warranted caution. But in Camille's case, that status had been cleared. A tag was supposed to have been removed. It hadn't been. Worse still, further checks revealed that the S-17 tag had not simply been left behind by clerical oversight, had been re-added. Manually, the investigation spread. Quietly, a pattern began to emerge. Of the flagged custody cases involving single parents traveling with minors, an overwhelming majority bore the same coding language. And of those, a disproportionate number involved mothers of color. What had been dismissed as routine caution was beginning to look less accidental or targeted. Camille's file became the test case. Her travel records were pulled. Her custody papers were matched across systems. The audit logs normally overlooked showed that her case had been accessed multiple times by external agency accounts that had no legal authority to amend court records. One such access, traced to a now deactivated user ID, had made a single alteration, restoring the S-17 tag to her travel profile without triggering a review. No one admitted who issued the change. The account used was tied to a third-party interagency database integration firm with a short contract history and no long-term federal oversight. The contractor dissolved 2 months after Camille's profile had been touched. A report circulated internally confidential. 4 now showed a pattern of custody misclassifications tied to families rerouted through private foster care review boards. Many had never contested their status, unaware of the coding or too weary to question it. Others were in systems too fragmented to follow. Camille had only been noticed because she whispered a name that still had weight. No public statements were made. Not yet. But within weeks, federal policy changed. The S-17 tag was frozen across all transportation systems. Custody reviews triggered mid-flight required direct confirmation from federal family court liaisons, not private agency databases. The change was subtle, but sweeping. Camille never asked for any of it. She never contacted the press, never filed a lawsuit. But her sealed record quietly misfiled, quietly corrected, had broken open a corner of something much larger, and somewhere in the data logs of a now disbanded subcontractor's archived server, the final amendment to her profile remained preserved, correction received. 17 flag removed, custody confirmed. It was signed not by a judge, not by an agent, but by a back-end systems administrator. No title, no headline, just a keystroke. The kind of change no one notices until someone like Camille refuses to disappear. Camera was angled so her face stayed in shadow. The backdrop was deliberately nondescript neutral wall, a soft gray chair, no windows, no personal artifacts. Her voice, though clear, had been filtered slightly to protect her identity. The documentary segment opened not with questions, but with silence. A pause, and then Camille began. She didn't recount the flight in chronological order. She didn't describe the plane or the turbulence or the baby's cries. Instead, she spoke of something quieter, of the pause between questions, of the shift in tone when politeness became scrutiny. She spoke about being read her clothing, her skin, her voice, how everything she did was interpreted through someone else's filter, until even the way she cradled her child seemed suspect. The producers gave her a pseudonym, Naomi. They didn't disclose the airline. They didn't need to. The footage once aired as part of a broader documentary on civil liberties and travel, focused not on scandal but on subtlety, the quiet mechanics of how someone could be questioned, separated, doubted not with violence, but with policy, with protocol, its unspoken consensus. Camille agreed to speak only once, and only on the condition that no one tried to frame her story as extraordinary. It wasn't unique, she said plainly. That's the problem. Her segment ran 12 minutes. The crew said later they used nearly everything she shared. Mitchell's interview came later in the episode. It wasn't filmed only his voice. It was recorded in a small studio off Port property. He hadn't intended to say yes when they first contacted him. But after 3 days of rereading the incident log and the silent post-flight review filed in his name, he agreed. His segment was shorter. It's just under 4 minutes. I kept thinking I was following procedure, he said. There were red flags, but none of the flags were about her. They were about what I was afraid might happen if I didn't act. I wasn't seeing danger. I was seeing my own fears. And I projected them onto someone who didn't flinch when I asked if the baby was hers. There was a pause in the audio, and when she didn't flinch, he said, I told myself that was strange too. He didn't identify Camille. He didn't try to apologize on camera. But his voice cracked once, just slightly, when he described handing Elijah back into her arms. The documentary aired quietly. It wasn't a headline story, but it circulated among legal clinics, diversity trainers, transportation unions. Within months, a number of regional airlines updated their midair verification protocols. A working group was formed with representatives from family courts, transportation security, and civil liberties advocates. Their first recommendation wasn't about technology, it was about language. The term suspicious behavior was revised in internal crew manuals. New examples were added. So were new questions. One airline began running training simulations in which staff were asked to navigate ambiguous travel scenarios without defaulting to assumption. Another introduced a module simply titled, Perception is Not Proof. Camille was never named publicly. Elijah was never shown. But her case, quietly distributed in redacted internal memos, changed more than a few forms. It changed how some eyes scanned faces. It changed how silence was read. And somewhere above the clouds in cabin crews now trained to ask questions with care rather than fear, the space for mothers like Camille widened just slightly, not because someone made room for her, but because she never asked for it. She simply never let them take it.